Who remembers the cradle when the child is gone? Who remembers the dust beneath it, the quiet place where a mother's eyes once wept, where breath turned to prayer and prayer turned to silence? If stories like this speak to something sacred in you, to memory, to justice, to silence, subscribe to the channel. Some stories were never meant to be forgotten. The house stood on Georgia soil, brittle with heat, honey-thick with rot. Its bones were made of pine and cruelty, nailed together with inheritance and the laughter of men who had never bled. Ivy crept up its sides like veins on an old woman's hand. The shutters wept when the wind passed through, and the floorboards remembered every step taken in hate or hunger. Inside this house was a woman named Louisa, but they did not say her name with reverence. They said it like a command or a cough or a thing meant to be stepped around. Yet Louisa moved through the house like breath itself, low, unnoticed, necessary. She was not born there, but her children were. 3 of them, 2 girls and a boy, whose limbs curled like roots into straw and whose eyelids fluttered like wings when they dreamed. Their cradle was a wooden box tucked near the hearth, warm with old fire, softened with rags, and shadowed by the iron that never stopped glowing. Louisa laid them down each night and hummed to them songs whose words had died centuries ago, remembered only by her blood and the bones that lived in it. She sang like a woman who had no one left to speak to but the dead. Her hands knew thread and ash. By candle breath, she stitched handkerchiefs for the mistress and buttons for the master, her fingers moving with the patience of a mourner. She never pricked herself, not once. Even the needle knew not to draw her blood. The mistress watched Louisa's children with eyes like cracked porcelain, brittle, gleaming, and hollow. She wore perfume that smelled of violets and vinegar. She tapped her fan when Louisa passed, and though she smiled, the house heard the tension in her teeth. The children laughed softly, played with feathers and corn husks, and touched the hem of their mother's skirt as though it were sacred. But even joy had to whisper in that house. Even laughter had to bow. That evening, when the sun went down like an old prayer, a crow landed on the roof beam above the nursery. He did not caw. He simply watched, one eye facing the cradle, the other facing the door that would soon forget how to open. Louisa saw him. She was kneeling in the dirt behind the smokehouse, folding baby garments still warm from the sun, when she looked up and saw his dark, feathered stillness against the dusk. And though her lips did not move, her soul whispered, "He has come before the fire." She touched the thread at her neck, a thin cord wrapped thrice around a nail-head charm. She stood slowly. The wind smelled like cinnamon and something was wrong. Inside, the cradle waited, and beneath it, the dust had already begun to shift. What does a needle remember when it sews the dead? Does it forget the softness of a living hem? Or does it carry each sorrow through the eye of the thread, one ghost at a time? The candle had nearly wept itself to death, its wax pooling like melted bones at the edge of the table. And still, Louisa stitched. The air was thick with the hush of mourning, that sacred silence that comes when the world pauses to watch a woman kneel beside death without falling into it. She was sewing a shroud for the child of Ruth, a girl born with no cry, no name, no hour. The baby came still as smoke, and Louisa wrapped her in cloth as if she might yet sing. The cloth was linen, faded and soft, and Louisa embroidered it with symbols too old for the white folks' books. Symbols passed by hands, not mouths. A star for return, a river for passage, an eye that never sleeps, a tongue of flame, a door that opens only once. She did not weep, she never did, not for death, not for herself. But her needle trembled like it carried more than thread, like it knew it was being watched by heaven and hell alike. The fire had burned low, the cradle creaked, the straw rustled, and from beneath her own hearth a small cough, then another. Her youngest, May, barely 4 summers, her cheeks darkened with heat, her breath a whisper, her brow damp with death's early dew. Louisa placed the burial cloth aside, not folding it, no, laying it down like it might still breathe. She lifted her child with hands that had delivered a dozen others, but this time they shook. She did not call for help. She did not knock upon the master's door. She already knew what answer would come. And when the mistress passed by in the hall and saw the girl curled on the dirt floor like an ember, she paused only to mutter, "She's half dead already. Let the Lord decide the rest." Then she was gone, leaving the scent of lavender and lye in her wake. That night the wind began to gather. A storm stirred in the fields but never broke. The trees leaned forward, but the sky stayed shut. And Louisa sat beside the cradle with thread in her lap and a song on her tongue that refused to end. It was a hymn she remembered from the old land, not in words, but in rhythm, in sway, in breath, in ache. But her voice faltered. She reached for the note and found it gone, as if the thread of her own soul had come undone. Outside, the wind whistled through the eaves. The dogs would not howl. The crows did not sleep. And Louisa stayed at the edge of the cradle, her eyes wide, her needle forgotten, waiting for a fever to pass or a door to open. But none did. And in the shadows, the burial cloth still shimmered, as though the symbols upon it were not stitched, but summoned. What kind of door forgets how to open? What kind of house learns not to listen when children call through smoke? And what does it mean when even heaven stands still and does not knock? The morning began like all others, quiet, bitter, butter-colored light filtering through the warped glass, the kind of light that burns without warmth, that lays like judgment across every crooked floorboard. The trees outside were still, too still. Even the wind refused to enter that day, as if it knew what would happen, as if it had whispered it to the crows in the early hush. And Louisa was polishing silver, her hands wrapped in rags soaked with vinegar and memory, her fingers tracing reflections that did not belong to her. She did not hear her children call, not at first. She heard only the mistress complaining of a draft, heard only the clink of spoons in glass, heard only the soft hiss of wealth being preserved. Because the night before, the master had heard hymns. Not his hymns, not those of organs or pew. He heard Louisa humming, heard her voice sliding through the cracks of wood and time, heard words too old for translation, notes too low to be called proper. He called them unholy, said they stirred the wrong spirits. And so, without telling her, he turned the iron key in the nursery door before dawn, locked it from the outside, and tucked the key inside his Sunday vest. Because no child needs their mother when they sleep, he told himself, and no slave girl needs to sing to the bones of her blood. So Louisa cleaned, as commanded, room to room, tray to tray, never knowing that the door behind her bobbies had forgotten how to open, until the milk began to burn. It was the first scent that came sweet at first, then bitter, then scorched. A mother's breast turned to smoke. She turned, confused. The fire in the hearth was cold. The kitchens were clean, no pot boiled over, but the air thickened. The breath of the house changed. And then the silence. A silence that held breath too long. A silence that echoed inside her like a hollow bell. She dropped the tray. The silver scattered like bones across the floor. Barefoot, she ran through the parlor, down the hall, up the staircase that had never welcomed her, to the nursery. And the door did not open, it would not yield, it would not move. She pressed her body against it, pressed her face to the grain, heard nothing, smelled everything. Smoke curled beneath the frame like a serpent, the kind from ancient books, the kind that speaks of sacrifice. She screamed once, a sound torn from beneath her ribs, not a word, not a name, just pain. And still the door stood quiet. The house did not shake. The windows did not break, the walls did not speak. And God did not arrive, not even to knock. There are songs that only ash can carry, songs that rise not from mouths but from ruin. When the cradle is gone and breath is no more, what lullaby remains? The fire had devoured quietly. No roar, no blaze, just heat, low and cruel, like a grudge whispered through wood. By the time the door was forced open, the nursery was a wound. Blackened walls, splintered cradles, and 3 small shadows etched in soot still in their sleeping shapes. One curled like a comma, one reaching, one facing the door. The room did not smell like death. It smelled like silence, like something that should not have been taken but was. Louisa stepped through the doorway, her bare feet sinking into layers of ash like walking on the memory of snow. She did not weep. She did not scream. Not even her breath dared make a sound. She fell to her knees, not from weakness but from reverence. And with hands that had once tucked blankets around bellies, she gathered what the fire had left behind. Carefully, lovingly, as if each fleck of soot still bore their names. Into her apron they went, the fragments, the softness, the ash of small ribs and small prayers. She held it to her chest, pressed it against the skin beneath her heart, and stood. That night no one spoke to her, not the master, not the mistress. Not even Ruth, who once braided her hair with corn silk and secrets. The other slaves turned their faces as she passed with the ashes wrapped tight like an infant swaddled in dark silk. Some turned away out of fear, some out of reverence. Some simply could not bear to look at a woman who carried death so tenderly. By candlelight, she sat on the floor of the quarters, the ashes in her lap, and began to hum. A lullaby, the same she used to sing beneath the hearth when 3 sets of eyes blinked up at her like stars. But this time the song had no melody, only rhythm, only breath, only sorrow. And though no child stirred, the walls seemed to lean in. The rafters creaked as if swaying. The wind held its hush a little longer. When the song ended, she reached not for cloth, but for the bone needle hidden beneath a floorboard. She dipped it in ash, and with her own blood as thread, she began to stitch. Not into fabric, but into the house itself, under the windows, behind the door hinges, beneath the sleeping mats, symbols, old ones, ones that predated even fire. She carved them softly in the tongue her grandmother taught her without words, a spiral for return, a fang for vengeance, a cradle that does not burn. And then, when there was nowhere left to write, she turned to her skin. One symbol beneath the collarbone, another at the wrist. One across the hollow of her throat so her voice would never be lost again. The thread burned as it passed through flesh, but she did not flinch. For what is pain to a woman who has held her children in smoke? Some songs do not end. They cling to the beams of the ceiling, hide in the splinters of wood, and breathe through the cracks between floorboards. And when no one sings them anymore, they sing themselves. The house had begun to change, not loudly, not at once, but in stillness. In breath that arrived too cold. In rooms that stayed damp no matter how high the sun climbed. In mirrors that no longer reflected only the living. The mistress heard it first, the lullaby, faint, soft. A woman's voice rising from the nursery long after the cradle was gone, after the walls were scrubbed and the rug replaced. She stood outside the door, hands trembling on the brass handle, listening as the voice curled upward, a gentle hum, wrapped in ash. It was Louisa's voice, though Louisa was not there. Not that night, not upstairs. She was asleep in the quarters, or at least her body was, but the rafters had remembered, and the song had taken root. The hymn began to drift from room to room, not sung but felt in the flicker of candle flames, in the way the air seemed to pulse around the fireplace, in the shiver that came even when the fire was full. And then the white children began to cough. First, the youngest. Rosy-cheeked with curls like soft butter, woke with blood in her mouth and eyes too wide for sleep. They gave her tea. They prayed in English. They sewed new linens, but the cough did not leave. It grew, and soon so did the silence. Each night, a different child would wake gasping, gripping sheets embroidered with Louisa's hands, napkins stitched with vines, pillowcases edged with threads dyed the color of dusk. Blood bloomed on white cloth like warnings, like flowers that should not grow in winter. The mistress refused to speak it aloud, but the master knew, for he dreamed of fire every night. He dreamed of flames rising up from the nursery floor, of little hands made of soot reaching toward him, of eyes without pupils, of cradles rocking long after the bobbies were gone. And each morning he woke to soot in his bed, not ashes, fresh soot, as if the fire had never ended. He blamed the chimney. He blamed the help. He blamed the Lord, but he never looked Louisa in the eye. And still the song did not stop. It filled the corners. It slipped beneath locked doors. It softened the hinges and cracked the plaster. Even the trees outside had begun to lean toward the house, toward the sound, toward the sorrow. Their branches brushing the shutters like fingers asking to be let in. And the house had begun to hum back. What thread is this that hums when touched? What cloth sighs when worn? What dresses itself not in silk nor in cotton, but in smoke, in sorrow, in the memory of ash that once had names? Louisa began to sew again, not for mourning this time, but for worship. The mistress called for dresses, fine ones, for herself and her daughters. New gowns for Sunday, for kneeling before God in white gloves and wide smiles. The old seamstress had taken ill. The house, she claimed, was breathing on her too heavily. So Louisa, silent and strange, was called back to the needle. And she obeyed as she always had, with a bowed head, steady hand, and eyes that burned but did not blink. But the thread she chose was not bright. It was black, deep as river mud, soft as funeral hymns. The hems she stitched were odd, curved where they should be straight, tight where they should float. But the women did not notice. They were too busy admiring the seams, how perfect they lay, how cool the cloth felt against their skin, cool like stone, cool like crypts. What they did not know was this: the linings were not of silk. Louisa had mixed ash into the fiber, not just any ash, their ash, ash that once giggled beside the hearth, ash that had been pressed into her apron, ash that still remembered lullabies. She worked at night when the moon was thin and watching. She dipped her fingers in oil and shadow. She whispered names as she stitched: May, Ruthie, John. The gowns were worn that very Sunday. The mistress in violet, the girls in blue and cream. Their boots tapped loudly across the chapel floor. Heads turned, eyes smiled, but the altar candles flickered. And the windows, the stained glass that had stood firm for 70 years, began to crack. Thin veins at first, then wide, weeping lines that spidered across saints, faces, and halos of colored light. A swarm of bees entered through the broken pane, drawn to something unseen. They flew not at the congregation, but at the pulpit, at the cross. The priest paused mid-sermon. His throat tightened. He coughed once, then again, then blood. The Bible fell from his hands, landing on open pages that fluttered like wings before going still. Gasps filled the chapel. Whispers. A child began to cry, but Louisa, seated in the last row, folded her hands over her lap and hummed. A sound low and broken, sacred and old, a psalm stitched from grief and fire. When they returned home, the mistress could not stop scratching. Her skin bloomed with red welts, like something buried was trying to rise. She called for slaves. She soaked in milk. She whispered Louisa's name not in prayer but in rage, in fear, in some cursed mix of both. At night she heard the thread in her gown tighten, felt the hem draw closer to her throat. She tore the dress off, but still she itched. Still she cursed. Still Louisa sang, not loudly, never loudly. But through the floorboards, through the walls, through the seams of the house, she sang. And the dresses, hung now in the wardrobe, began to hum along. Some houses do not hold memories. They hold witnesses. They remember not in silence, but in rot. not in grief but in return. And when they begin to die, they do not collapse, they reveal. The estate had once gleamed like a lie. Fresh painted shutters, silver polished to near blindness, mirrors that told only the stories the master wished to hear. But now the shine had turned. The mirrors tarnished first, not all at once, but in rings, like the breath of something ancient pressed against the glass. The center stayed clean, but around it darkness bloomed. Then the silver. Platters blackened where no hand had touched. Spoons turned dull. Knives grew streaked with something like soot, though no chimney touched them. The doors, once proud in their closings, refused to stay shut. They drifted open in the night, creaking like old bones, or swung wide at the hour before dawn when dreams still clung to the skin like fog. Louisa spoke to no one, not the other servants, not the master. Not the children who still lived, shivering in rooms that no longer warmed. She whispered only to the fire and sometimes to the wind when it curled around the corners of the house like a dog remembering its grave. They say the mistress had not bathed in weeks, said her skin crawled, said she heard the rustle of fabric even when she lay naked. They found her in the washtub, face down, hair unbound, mouth open, stuffed with thread, black thread. Spools of it are still floating on the surface like drowned snakes. The master said it was madness, said she had sewn too long, said the heat, the sorrow, the bees all had cracked her mind. But Louisa said nothing. She did not flinch when the body was carried out. She did not look at the sky when it rained that night. She only stood beside the kitchen fire, hands folded, as if waiting for something only the dead could deliver. Then Louisa vanished. 3 days. No one saw her. No one heard the hymns. No threads were spun. No food passed her lips. And then, on the morning of the 4th, someone saw her. At the edge of the estate, where the trees grew oldest and the soil remembered blood, she stood at the base of a red oak. She knelt and poured something at its roots, something gray, something fine, something that caught the light like sorrow, ashes, a final offering, a quiet release. And as she stood, the wind rose. The branches leaned low as if to thank her or to shield her from what came next. That evening, the house began to burn. Not in flames, not yet, but in the heat. From within, the walls began to sweat, the floorboards buckled, paint blistered in slow silence. No fire was seen, but the air grew heavy, the rooms grew dark, and deep in the bones of the house beneath the nursery, a low hum began to rise, as if something buried had finally remembered how to breathe. Some women vanish, not in fear, not in flight, but like embers carried skyward, like the last breath of a hymn that refuses to end. Louisa was gone. Nobody, no scream, no farewell. One morning she was sweeping the ash-blown step. That evening she was nowhere. Some say she walked into the river, stepped gentle into the reeds and disappeared as if the water had been waiting for her, as if it knew her sorrow by name. Others say she became wind, the kind that rustles through broken shutters at dusk, that carries the smell of burnt thread and old milk and lullabies too soft to write down. But no one saw her leave. No footprints. No trail. Only the red oak remained, the one where she had knelt, where she had poured her grief into the roots. And in winter, when the earth should have slept, the tree began to bloom. White blossoms in the deadest month. Petals are soft as ash, fragrant not with sweetness, but with the smell of smoke and cradle wood. Children would wander too close, drawn by something they did not understand. Their mothers would call them back, eyes wide, hands trembling. The land had changed. It sang at night. Not loudly, never loudly, but in hushes. In low croons that curled from the soil like mist. Songs that made dogs whimper and crickets still. Songs that sounded like her. Like Louisa's hum drawn out through wind and root and stone, the estate was never rebuilt. After the fire took what it hadn't already betrayed, no one laid brick again. No hands dared bless that ground. The fields returned to thistle and thorn. The barn rotted. And where the great house once stood, only a single stone. No name carved, no date, just a needle and a flame. Those who came near said they felt watched, not by anger but by memory, by something ancient and maternal, something that had lost everything but would not be forgotten. The local preacher warned against visiting, called it cursed, said the land was haunted by sorrow dressed as holiness. But still some came. Some women left offerings, spools of black thread, feathers, bits of cloth embroidered with stars and eyes and rivers. And the wind, always the wind, would answer. Soft, low, a whisper, almost not there. But if you listened, if you let the silence speak first, you would hear it. Mama's here. Not in body, not in pain, but in the hum beneath your ribs, in the breath between dreams, in the soft pull of thread through skin. The roots remembered her song, and now so do we.